again, we're going to start with the McKinley Tariff of 1890. This raised the tariff put down to the highest peacetime level ever. So the McKinley Tariff raised the tariff to the highest peacetime level ever. Again, they were trying to promote American industry, trying to promote the protective tariff. It raised it to the highest peacetime level ever, almost to 50% on the average. They were trying to protect American industry by making foreign goods a lot more expensive, by having an almost 50% tariff. What group was really upset with this McKinley tariff? That's the significance is what group of people was upset. This group of people was always upset throughout history with tariffs. What group of people was upset, and they were rising in power at the time? Go ahead, Jessica.
Southerners?
Farmers in general. So farmers in general were upset. Southern and Western farmers. Again, what are the two reasons throughout history why farmers do not like tariffs? High taxes on imports. Why do farmers not like it? What are two reasons why farmers don't like tariffs in general? Yeah, go ahead, Becca.
Because it favors the north and the country.
Oh, it favors the industry over farmers. Yes, it favors industry. But what does it make it harder for farmers to do, Sarah?
It makes manufactured tools and machines more expensive.
Right. It makes their manufactured products more expensive. So one thing is it makes the manufactured products more expensive. Machines, tools, supplies, seed, all of that's more expensive. And then it makes it harder for them to do what? It makes it harder for farmers. A high tariff by the United States, yeah, Brooke, makes it harder for farmers. Abby?
To sell a product?
To export their crops overseas because of retaliatory tariffs. So it makes it harder to export their crops because of retaliatory tariffs. So the farmers were very upset with the McKinley tariff. The Bessemer process, number 72, is a cheap way to make, the Bessemer process is a cheap way to produce what? It was essential, go ahead, Cole.
Was it steel?
Steel, right. It was a cheap way to produce steel. And steel is the building block of the American Industrial Revolution. Steel is the building block of the Industrial Revolution. All you have to do is look at skyscrapers. Skyscrapers would not be possible had it not been for steel. And this made steel cheap enough to be mass produced. So before this it was impossible. Before the Bessemer process it was impossible to cheaply produce steel because it was so hard to get rid of the impurities in the iron. It was really hard to get, purify or to rid the iron of its impurities. How does the Bessemer process work? It was invented by Henry Bessemer in Great Britain. How does it work, Hannah?
You just blow cold air on iron.
Right, you blow cold air on hot iron. So you heat up iron to like it's red hot, and you blow cold air at it, and it actually takes the impurities out by doing that. So blasting cold air at red hot iron, molten iron, takes out its impurities and creates steel. Blasting cold air at red hot iron takes out the impurities and creates steel. The company town, number 73. These are really common in the 1800s. What was a company town? A lot of people lived in the company town in this time period. Yeah, Brooke?
Was it like when one company owned everything in the town, so everything was like kind of more expensive to just got that?
Exactly. The company owned everything in the town. So the people who worked in the company would live in a company town, and the company owned everything. The company owned the housing, so they paid rent to the company. The company owned the store. And what problem did workers who lived in company towns get into? Partly because everything was owned by the company. Cole?
I think they were a lot of debt.
Right, they had massive debt. They got into debt, and the reason they got into debt was because they got credit at the company store. Pretty easy credit. The prices were higher, and they got easy credit. So the company had no trouble lending money to the people in their company at the company store, but then the people in the company got in debt. So the people working in the company got in debt, so there's pretty big debt problems. And your book talked about how coal miners would be born in a company house, nurtured by the company store, and then buried in the company graveyard. The company controlled and owned everything. But a lot of times they took advantage of the workers, and the workers became in debt. Progress and poverty. You want to remember the name Henry George. Henry George is famous for Progress and Poverty. And he wrote this book basically to talk about how is it that there was so much progress in American society and all this wealth, and yet you had so much poverty. So the general theme of Progress and Poverty, the general theme of the book was we had incredible progress, we had multimillionaires, we had huge industries, we had a lot of wealth created in America in the late 1800s, and yet we had growing poverty and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. And he kind of tried to address the question, how could it be? How can this be? How can you have all this wealth and yet all this poverty? How can you have progress and then poverty at the same time? And he had a solution for it. Does anyone remember from reading? What was Henry George's solution to progress and to the problem of like the gap between the rich and the poor and all of that? Go ahead, Cole.
It was a one-time 100% tax on like increased property values.
Exactly. He said that the profit that people made owning land, the profit that land speculators made, and the profit that people made who owned land was unearned. He called it the unearned increment. He said, if you own land and you make money because you own land, or if you're a land speculator, buy land at a low price, sell it at a high price, it's an unearned increment. You don't earn that profit. The value of the property goes up because the population is increasing and there's a fixed amount of land, but you don't earn that profit. So therefore, his solution was a single 100% tax on the unearned profits that people got from land. A single 100% tax on the unearned profits people got from land, which would mean all their profits. 100% tax means you give up everything to the government. So he said, hey, it's unearned anyway, so a single 100% tax on the unearned profits people make from land, including those land speculators made, and he would use the money to eliminate inequalities. They would use that money to eliminate the inequalities in society, social programs that help the poor, that type of thing. So the money from the 100% tax would be used to eliminate inequalities. This is fairly socialistic, his suggestion, that we're just going to tax all these, 100% tax on all these profits, take all that money, and then use it to help the poor and help eliminate inequalities. Horatio Alger was known for juvenile fiction. A lot of his stories were about like newspaper boys and young men who made it big. And the theme of Horatio Alger's books was number 75, that virtue, industry, and honesty, industry is hard work, and honesty lead to success, wealth, and honor. Virtue, industry, and honesty lead to success, wealth, and honor. So virtue, industry, and honesty lead to success, wealth, and honor. And he is famous, he is known for the rags to riches stories. His stories put down were rags to riches. He would have like a boy that would work hard and would be, dirt poor and would rise up to become very rich. Rags to riches stories. That if you work hard and you're honest and virtuous, you get success, wealth, and honor. 76, Carrie Nation. She's an interesting lady. Go ahead, Brooke. What did she do?
She would add alcohol with like a hatchet, right?
Yes.
And she was trying to encourage prohibition.
Yes, she fought for prohibition, the banning of the sale of alcoholic beverages. So she fought for prohibition, the banning of the sale of alcoholic beverages. I believe her first husband had died from alcoholism, and she was basically on a mission to get places to ban the sale of alcohol, but the way she did it was with violence. She would take an axe or a hatchet, and she would go from bar to bar and destroy the bar. She basically went in there and just busted the bars up, or busted the taverns up with their hatchet. Just basically vandalism, just vandalized them. There's a famous incident of Carrie Nation in front of what's now, I think, Finnegan's Bar in Fond du Lac. And there's a famous story of her that when she was in Fond du Lac, someone presented her, I think the bar owner presented her with a bottle of booze, and she had a hatchet from beneath her dress that she always had ready, and she took it out and busted it up, and then said she was heading towards Oshkosh, the wickedest city in the old Northwest, the whole Northwest. Of course, if you know about the number of bars per square mile in Oshkosh, you would understand why Carrie Nation called it the wickedest city in the whole Northwest. But she was at first at Fond du Lac. So she basically, that's what she did. She kind of went around and just destroyed bars. All right, moving on to A Century of Dishonor. Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor. This book did what? What did this book say? A Century of Dishonor, Helen Hunt Jackson is famous for. This book is, what did this book do? What did this book talk about? This recorded the record of broken treaty obligations of the U.S. government with the Native Americans. It pretty much criticized U.S. policy towards Native Americans. It criticized U.S. policy towards Native Americans, and it talked about the record of broken treaty obligations, the record of broken treaty obligations of the U.S. government with Native Americans. Treaty after treaty after treaty was broken. Really criticized criticized the U.S. government's Native American policy. Basically criticized how the government had dealt with Indians over the years. And sometimes people will say, like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin is to slavery what Helen Hunt Jackson and A Century of Dishonor is to Native Americans. Really rallied the public against the government's questionable policy of dealing with Native Americans and breaking treaties and promises. And then number 78, what was the long drive? What was the long drive exactly, Haley?
Wasn't it when cowboys drove herds to like a railroad terminal?
Exactly. This refers to the cowboys taking the herds, like millions of cattle, millions of steer, longhorn cattle, they're big, mean cattle, and taking them from Texas to railroads in Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. So it refers to taking the cowboys, taking the longhorn cattle along trails northward to Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. And you had to have a lot of talent to be able to do this, but they would basically, the cowboys would start in Texas and they would go northward maybe 1,000 miles on the Chilton Trail or other trails, which are, you can see a map in your book, and they would go over wide open country. You just have to be just gorgeous, beautiful, wide open country, and they're taking these cattle in one direction, and they would take them to the transcontinental railroads then in Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming, and then the cattle would be put on trains and shipped to the slaughterhouses in Kansas City and Chicago, etc. And before turning the page, why did this era of the cowboy end? You know, it started in, it's usually the era of the cowboy is like between 1866 and 1888. Usually, why did, in the 1880s, why did the era of the open range, this wide open range and the era of kind of the cowboy, why did it come to an end in the 1880s? Yeah, Dallas is named, you know, now they call them the Dallas Cowboys, but cowboys really passed out of existence, like the true cowboy passed out of existence in the 1880s. Why did this open range, concept of the open range die out? Yeah, go ahead.
Was it overgrazing?
Overgrazing and overproduction is one reason. So overgrazing, too many cows, too little grass. Overproduction was a reason it died out. When you produce too much, it lowers the price and you stop making a profit. A couple other things happened before turning the page. Go ahead, Haley.
Harsh winters.
2 harsh winters, 2 horrific winters, kind of like the winter we had last year here in Wisconsin, that killed a lot of cattle. So 2 really, really bad winters in the 1880s. And, yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
The railroads were able to go both ways, and
Yeah, a lot of people started coming out west, and so a lot of sheep herders and homesteaders came out west, and they fenced off their land with a new type of fence, the barbed wire. So you had a lot of people that came west, like homesteaders and sheep herders, that fenced off their land, that made it impossible for the cowboys just to take all these cattle northward, because now they would run into fenced off land. We're now going to go to number 39. Political machines and political bosses. So political machines and political bosses. Does anyone remember from reading what's a political machine? What's a political machine exactly? Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Was it when people would employ others and then they'd get their vote in polls?
Close. There were political organizations that controlled city governments. Political organizations that controlled city governments with the purpose of keeping one party in power. So political organizations that controlled city governments with the purpose of keeping one party in power. And it's the main way city government worked in this time period, in most big cities. Political organizations that controlled city governments with the purpose of keeping one party in power. And they were pretty organized political systems. So there was democratic political machines that dominated cities, and then other cities were dominated by Republican political machines. The most famous machine was Tammany Hall. Put down Tammany Hall in New York. Tammany Hall was the most famous political machine. The head of the boss was the head of the machine, and the boss that was the head of the Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine in New York, was William Marcy Tweed. Boss Tweed, very famous. And the thing to know about these machines and their bosses is that they were very corrupt. And some examples of corruption is they would basically embezzle taxpayer money. They would take taxpayer money by overcharging for things. There's the famous $13 million courthouse that really was designed to cost $250,000, but the taxpayers of New York were basically charged $13 million for a $250,000 courthouse. So lots of corruption, embezzlement. Could you also put down political bosses would receive bribes and kickbacks? They would receive bribes and kickbacks. And then they also would buy votes or have dead people vote. Very common for political machines to have dead people vote. How does that work? You just don't, when people die, if they're on the registry and they're basically registered voters and they die, you simply don't take them off the list. And if it's a democratic political machine, these dead people vote, continue to vote, election after election after election for the Democratic Party. So you basically stuff the ballot box and you have all these people that have already died, but they're still voting for that party every election. So you have dead people voting too. And the way the bosses put down, the way the machines kept in power is by keeping the immigrants on their side. So the main way they kept in power was by keeping the immigrants on their side. And the question is, how did they keep the immigrants on their side? They had the support of the immigrants, these bosses. How did they keep the immigrants on their side? Yeah, go ahead, Cole.
They established schools, buildings, places they could go for housing and education and health.
Well, yeah, they provided services for the immigrants. They provided schools. They made sure parks were built. They made sure. But what did they do more directly for the immigrants, Ian?
Provided food and jobs.
Yeah, they provided jobs for immigrants. And put this down. I know you're running out of room, but yeah, they provided jobs for the immigrants. They would pay for emergencies, like funerals or other emergencies. They would keep them out of trouble with the law, so if they were in trouble with the law, they would get them out of trouble with the law, considering they could basically buy and pay for judges and police departments and stuff like that. They even gave immigrants turkeys at Christmas. You might get a turkey at Christmas from Boss Tweed. So, moving on then to the Gilded Age, number 40. The term the Gilded Age refers to what? When you see the Gilded Age in U.S. history, it's talking about the, which period? Go ahead.
I want to say
Ted?
late 1800s.
Right, late 1800s. So the Gilded Age is the late 1800s. Gilded means gold covered. So it's where it's kind of, it looks good on the outside, but underneath it's kind of a bunch of junk. And that's kind of what the 1800s is like. You have all this wealth and it looks good on the surface, but underneath it you have all this poverty. And the person who came up with this term is Mark Twain. Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens, put down Mark Twain. And Charles Dudley Warner wrote a book. So Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner wrote a book called The Gilded Age, and that's where the term comes from. So Mark Twain, you may know, wrote like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and a whole bunch of other really famous books. And he wrote this book called The Gilded Age with Charles Dudley Warner where he coined that term. Number 41, pretty interesting concept. What was the social gospel exactly? What exactly was the social gospel? Chet?
The wanting to use Christianity to improve society and social justice.
Yeah, Christianity was this idea that they needed to apply the social gospel was the idea that they needed to apply Christianity to society. It's applied Christianity, that Christianity should be applied to society, not just preached in churches. That Christians go out and they fight, as Ted said, they fight for social justice. They go out and they fight for social justice. They don't just talk about love your neighbor as yourself, they fight for it. And some of probably the main thing of the main idea of the social gospel is that churches should tackle the burning social issues of the day. Churches should tackle the burning social issues of the day. They shouldn't ignore them. They should fight for them. And I want you to write down a list. What were the burning social issues of the day? They included abolishing child labor. They believed, so they wanted to abolish child labor, those in the social gospel movement. They wanted a shorter work week. They wanted a living wage. They wanted a living wage for people, and they even wanted insurance for workers injured in factories. So they wanted abolishment of child labor, a shorter work week, a living wage, and insurance for workers injured in factories. And last but not least, I'd like you to put down that those who believed in the social gospel predicted that socialism would be the logical outcome of Christianity. That socialism would be the logical outcome of Christianity. A lot of them believed that if the government was running the businesses and took over the economy, it would really help and all these social inequalities would disappear. So, as a student of American history, when you listen to the news and you hear about, we have a pretty strong Christian right that's still fairly strong in the Republican Party today. It's known as the Christian right. And they gave a lot of support, for example, to our former President George W. Bush. You should also know there's a Christian left in American history. So this is the Christian left. This is kind of the social justice that's still out there today. There's still the Christian left out there today. You don't hear about them as much as the Christian right, but they're out there. And this is kind of the Christian left, more of the liberal type Christian, fight for social justice, that type of thing. All right, let's move on to the settlement houses and Jane Addams and Hull House. What were settlement houses, number 42? What exactly were settlement houses? What were settlement houses? Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
They were places set up to help immigrants where they could stay for a while, get education, and resources for them?
Yeah, they were places that were built right in the middle of poor immigrant neighborhoods. So they were houses to help the poor that existed in the middle of poor neighborhoods. And they were usually run by middle-class reformers that were often college-educated women. So they were houses that helped the poor that existed in the middle of poor neighborhoods. And they were usually run by college-trained women, middle-class reformers that were often college-trained women, college-educated women. And the most famous of the settlement houses I've listed there, Hull House in Chicago, run by Jane Addams, one of the most famous settlement house workers. Hull House run by Jane Addams is famous. What were some of the things, the services provided by settlement houses? I'd like you to write those down. Like, what are some things that settlement houses did for immigrants? What's an example of the type of service that they provided to immigrants, or the things that they did? Yeah, Carl.
They educated them and taught them English.
Yeah, they taught them English, educated them especially, so they had English instruction put down. They had job counseling. You want to write these down. So English instruction, job counseling, cultural activities. I'm sorry, Sarah. Cultural activities. Were you going to say something else? Okay, so cultural activities, like, they might have a celebration of Polish fest or something, if they're in a Polish neighborhood. They would have a bathhouse where people could take a bath. Back in the time period where people only did that once in a while. They had playground, kindergarten, daycare, kindergarten a lot of times. So they had all these services they provided. Edward Bellamy's book, The Looking Backward, this is one of the more popular fiction books of this time period. Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. What was this book about? You remember from reading. Yeah, Hannah.
Was there a man that fell asleep for a long time? He woke up in 2000 and looked back at the injustices of 1887, like the political and economic issues that were going on.
Yeah, and then how they had disappeared because it was a socialist utopia in 2000. So a man falls asleep in 1887, and he wakes up in the year 2000 to find that America has become a socialist utopia. Meaning the government owns and controls all the businesses. The government owns and controls all the businesses, and it's a socialist utopia where there isn't inequality, there isn't poverty, everyone's happy, all the social injustices have melted away. So this fiction book was really pushing socialism, and just so you realize, there was a big movement towards socialism among a lot of Americans in this time period. And this book helped that out by having this fantasy where the person falls asleep in 1887, they wake up in the year 2000 to find out America has become completely socialist, the government owns and controls everything, and injustices and inequalities have faded away. And they started like 150, they called them nationalist clubs because they wanted the government to nationalize industry. Nationalize means take it over. And they had formed these clubs supporting the ideas of Edward Bellamy's book all over the country. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, Frances E. Willard. This was led by Frances E. Willard, and why did this say? They really fought for prohibition. So even though we talked about temperance before the Civil War, where they tried to get people to voluntarily stop drinking, the WCTU wanted to ban the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. They wanted prohibition. They wanted to ban the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. And what is the main reason why? As women, what is the main reason why they wanted to ban the sale of alcoholic beverages? Why did they want to just stop people from being able to make and sell alcoholic beverages? As women, they said it was most damaging to what? That alcohol was damaging, Ted?
To men? Like workers?
They had a bigger concern than that. Go ahead, Dylan.
Would be like the family.
Right, the family. Because it led to domestic abuse of women and children. So they said alcoholism hurt the family. It led to abuse of women and children, especially domestic abuse. This really becomes the first organization to identify and combat domestic violence, the WCTU. They talked about how drunk husbands would come and beat their wives and daughters and beat their wives and children. And how does this fit in with the idea was it was the mothers they were moral guardians. It was their job to be the moral guardians of society. Where does that come from? This is part of their role as moral guardians. Go ahead, Brooke.
Was it or public motherhood, or was it
The one after
cult of domesticity?
cult of domesticity, right? This ties in with the cult of domesticity. Remember, a woman's place is in the home as a moral guardian. So being for prohibition, being in favor of banning the sale of alcoholic beverages was seen as an extension of their role as, their role as moral guardians. They were the moral guardians of the refuge of home, called their places in the home, but then they were also supposed to protect the morals, and therefore fighting against the sale of alcoholic beverages is part of that. And then Thornstein-Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class. This book criticized the wealthy. Why? How did this book criticize the wealthy? This is the criticism of the wealthy. Basically, he said that he criticized the wealthy for engaging in what he called conspicuous consumption. So Veblen criticized the wealthy for engaging in, and I've got it listed there, in what he called conspicuous consumption. Now we know what consumption means, to consume things, and the conspicuous means easy to see. What did Thornstein-Veblen mean by conspicuous consumption? What did he mean by that? Yeah, Nick.
Just like buying like just stupid things and just wasting their money.
Yeah, he meant that there was a competition among the wealthy to see who could live in the grandest style. He said there was a competition among the wealthy to show off their wealth and to show that they had a lot of money. So there's a competition among the wealthy to see who could live in the grandest style, to show off their wealth. And he basically said this is a total waste, that no real human needs were met. Such excessive displays of wealth were a total and complete waste. And in your notes I gave you some examples. At one dinner party, the men were given cigars wrapped in $100 bills. Really? Do you really need to do that? Another man spent $10,000 on a dinner for 72 of his supposed friends. The enormous dinner table had a pond in it in which 4 swans swam. And we know about Cornelius Vanderbilt. He had 70 rooms in his house. 2 of the rooms in his house were built in France, torn apart, shipped to America, and rebuilt. And Thornstein-Veblen said, this is just a waste. This is not really satisfying any real need in society. It's not a real investment. It doesn't make society better. It doesn't create jobs or anything like that. All right, our next set then is 54 through 59. So 54 through 59, the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act, number 54, is the greatest giveaway in American history. The government has never given away something like they did with the Homestead Act. Social Security checks, food stamps don't even come close to corporate giveaways today. I don't even really think come close to the Homestead Act as far as what they gave away. What is the Homestead Act? Yeah, Cory.
Wasn't it if the person lived on the land for 5 years, they got 660 acres and...
Yeah, so you got 160 acres of free land, 160 acres of free land out west to any American adult citizen if they agree to live on the land for 5 years and improve it. So they got 160 acres of free land, and the stipulation is they had to live on the land and improve it for 5 years. And then the land would be theirs. 160 free acres for any American family or any American adult that wanted it. 160 acres of free land if they lived on the land for 5 years and improved it. What were the problems with this Homestead Act? Go ahead, Jessica.
Some of the land was not, people weren't able to live on it for 5 years because they couldn't farm it very well.
Right, some of the land was really dry. The Western Great Plains, 160 acres was not enough to make a living as a farmer on the dry Great Plains. It was so dry that 160 acres was not enough, especially in some parts of the western Great Plains. Yeah, Becca?
Didn't some people just have to give up part of their land to drought?
Or they had to give up part of their land to drought. We could probably put that in the same, wasn't enough to farm, or they had to give up the land to drought. Yeah, Hannah.
Some people, some companies would pay people to go and sort of take ownership of the land, and the companies would just take advantage of the natural resources and go.
Exactly, and then so companies and land speculators would use dummy homesteaders to acquire all this extra land, and then they would either sell it for a profit or use it for themselves. So companies and land speculators would use dummy homesteaders to acquire all this land. And what I mean by dummy homesteader is they would get a bunch of people, they would use the names of a bunch of people that were never going to go out west, and use their names to get 160 acres each. Your book talks about how they would take a bunch of people out for a beer, and they basically get their names and get their permission to use their names so that they could get 160 acres. And then they would get all these 160-acre plots using these people's names, and then they would sell it for a profit, or corporations would end up with it to basically just turn a profit or exploit the natural resources. And then your book even talked about how one of the people who put up a dwelling, I think it was a 12 by 14 dwelling, and he said, look, I've improved my land, I put up a 12 by 14 dwelling. It was 12 inches by 14 inches. That was the dwelling he put up on the land to improve it. 12 by 14 inches. A 12 by 14 dwelling. All right, the Yellowstone National Park. All you really need to know for 55, it's the first national park. It's the very first national park. After exploring Yellowstone, a group of adventurers insisted that the natural beauty of the area need to be protected. Some of the strange phenomena that they saw occur at Yellowstone, if you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. That the beauty and the strange phenomena, they needed to protect this land, so it's the first national park, Yellowstone. The U.S. Fisheries Commission, I'm just going to give this to you, it would investigate the causes for the decrease of commercial fish and other aquatic animals in the United States. So the U.S. Fisheries Commission would investigate the causes for the decrease of commercial fish and other aquatic animals in the United States. Investigate the causes for the decrease of commercial fish and other aquatic animals in the United States. And it would recommend solutions to the U.S. Congress. The whole point of this is there was a beginning environmental movement in the late 1800s. The beginning of the environmental movement. The green movement really starts in the late 1800s. And the U.S. Fisheries Commission, the idea was, look, we're losing all these commercial fish and aquatic animals, and we need to stop the decrease of this. We've got to stop this before it becomes worse, and they recommended solutions. But we in Wisconsin should really know about John Muir. John Muir, who was born in Scotland and raised in Wisconsin on a farm near Portage, Wisconsin. John Muir is famous for being the great naturalist who wanted to protect the environment, one of the greatest naturalists of all time. So he was known for being a great naturalist, and he did much to protect the environment. I'm sure he's one of Al Gore's heroes. I would guess, I don't know for sure, but I would guess. Great naturalist, did much to protect the environment, and he was known as the father of our national park system. He was known as the father of the national park system. He is the one who helped in the creation of Yosemite National Park in 1890. So he's known as the father of our national park system. He also founded the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club put down as an organization devoted to the protection of the wilderness in the mountain region of the Pacific Coast. An organization devoted to the protection of the wilderness in the mountain region of the Pacific Coast. So devoted to the protection of the wilderness in the mountain region of the Pacific Coast. It's got a broader mission today, I believe, but that was the purpose of the Sierra Club when founded. Now, there's a couple questions tomorrow on the Turner thesis. Frederick Jackson Turner was a University of Wisconsin professor who wrote this famous thesis this famous argument about American history. And the first thing I want you to know for number 58 is what is meant by the term frontier. He talked about the importance of the frontier in American history. In fact, that was the name of his essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. What was the frontier? What is meant by the term frontier? I want you to know what that means. Nick?
The edge of the settled land.
Right. The frontier is the region in the West on the edge of settlement, where there's explorers and pioneers and settlers. A region in the West on the edge of settlement. And America always had a frontier. Going back to when Jamestown, Virginia was founded, the frontier were the foothills of the mountains. Then later on, closer to the Revolution, the frontier was the mountains itself. Then after the Revolution, the frontier was over the mountains. It's this unsettled kind of this region in the West on the edge of settlement, where it's somewhat unsettled and people are settling. And what Turner said in his thesis is that the frontier was over. That according to the 1890 U.S. Census, there no longer was a frontier. The era of having a frontier was gone. But more importantly, Turner argued that it was the frontier that made Americans different than Europeans. It's because we always had a frontier that made the history of the United States different than European history, that made Americans different than Europeans. The frontier is what distinguished the United States from Europe and made the United States different than Europe. And how? How were Americans different than Europeans according to Frederick Jackson Turner? How were Americans different than Europeans? He said that Americans were more inventive, were more practical, were more self-reliant. They picked themselves up by their own bootstraps. They're more self-reliant. And that they valued individualism. They were more individualistic. And he said these are, the reason we have these traits is because we've always had this frontier. And he said Americans were more practical and inventive and self-reliant and individualistic than Europeans. Finally, he bought into, Turner reasserted the safety valve theory that had actually been around before his thesis, had been around since the Civil War. What was the safety valve theory? What was that? Go ahead, Haley.
Wasn't that when like city dwellers went to the west to become farmers?
Right, that in America, that if you were not doing well in the East, if you hit hard times, you could always go west and get ahead. So the idea was that the West was a safety valve for the people in the East. That whenever hard times hit, the unemployed could move west and be prosperous. If you were not doing well in the East, you could always go west and get ahead. The criticism of that you should put down was that the poor people in the East couldn't afford to go west. So the criticism of the safety valve theory was, yeah, okay, so if you're not doing well in the East, you can go west. Well, the people who are poor in the East, they couldn't afford to go west anyway. And that's the flaw or the criticism of the safety valve theory.